Hi, I'm Elaine Jones from the State Department. My question is directed primarily at Dr. Brown the Younger, but I'd appreciate comments from anyone else on the panel. Dr. Brown, you seemed very comfortable with the Supreme Council, a Supreme Tribunal, basing its decisions and policies on Sharia. I want to ask you how you see that panning out on various issues, for example, domestic violence, where the Quran says it instructs a man that if his wife is disobedient, he should admonish her, ban her from the bed, and beat her. There are hadith where...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off so that we can actually we have about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
And so I think we got the gist of the question on how the Sharia will actually be implemented and the role of the Supreme Council on these issues. I'll
answer two questions.
Okay, please, go ahead.
The first is on the role of religious minorities, especially Coptic Christians. I mean, I think that when we talk about identity politics, it takes two to tango, right? I mean, it's not just Islamists who are saying, identity politics. Other people who tell them, we can't change the Constitution at all to make it any more Islamic, even in its, connotations. That's, I think, just as much identity politics. And there are Mustashar Tariq al-Bishri, a number of Islamist thinkers in Egypt have come up with very viable, convincing arguments for how you can allow Christians or women or anybody to hold positions of authority, even head of state, and still have Sharia-compliant legal system. And their ideas should be put into the debate with other more conservative Islamist ideas, and I think they probably will eventually win. I think eventually you'll have actually an understanding of Sharia law which allows Christians to be president of Egypt or women to be president of Egypt. I think the way that you're going to guarantee that does not happen is to get up and keep telling Egyptians that they can't have more public commitment of the nation's identity to Islam. I mean, I think this is one of the things what's led to the power of the Islamists over the years is consistently an elite with a different lifestyle telling the majority of the people that they don't have the right to have a role in forming the country's legal political identity. And as long as that creates identity politics, and as long as that's the case, you don't actually have the space for more moderate and still viable Islamic ideas to come forward and convince people and lead to a legal system in which minorities and Muslims actually have completely equal status before the law. On the issue of and things like, the Islamists didn't really win the 7 elections. Okay, I mean, I don't know. I'm a Democrat. I follow not Democratic Party. I believe in democracy. I don't know how else you can sit and say, Barack Obama didn't really win the election. The American people are just, they're in some kind of haze or they have false consciousness or something like that. But the fact of the matter is polls speak and you have to listen. On the issue of the Supreme, I think you mean Supreme Constitutional Court is what I mentioned. I don't know what the Supreme Council is unless this is some weird movie and there's like some council that makes these decisions. I'm talking about Supreme Constitutional Court, which is the body under the Mubarak era and until today, which actually would define and decide whether or not a certain law or piece of legislature is compatible with the Sharia. So that's what I was speaking about.
Okay, great. Who else wants to take on the enormous set of questions that we have? Nathan, go ahead.
I'm not going to take on the enormous set of questions. I'm going to address one remark, just two remarks that kind of build on some things that have already been said. I think when you're approaching debates about Sharia, the role of the Islamic Sharia in Egypt, I think if you focus on kind of these generalities, you're going to get one kind of result. The simple fact is that the phrase Islamic Sharia has very positive resonance for most Egyptians. Not for all Egyptians, but for most of them. And so the real question in terms of legal and constitutional engineering really has to focus on particular structures and who's got authority to do what. That's why you have to take a look at what this provision is for Al-Azhar. As Amr says, it's given some advisory role. In my mind, it's in a very strong advisory role. It would be very difficult for Al-Azhar to take a position and for a politician to say, well, Al-Azhar says that, but I disagree. It would be but the question isn't how is Al-Azhar brought into the debate? Who has the authority to call on them? Who within Al-Azhar speaks? How is Al-Azhar organized? If the Constitutional Court is going to continue to play a role, who's going to be sitting? How justice is going to be pointed to that Constitutional Court? Those are the really nitty-gritty questions that I think really need an awful lot more attention. The second thing that I will say is simply about performance of Islamists in elections. I'm Nathan Brown, I'm not Nate Silver, so I can't really make great electoral predictions, but I will anyway. My sense is that if Egyptians who are opposed to the Islamists think that they can go into elections and they won't have to deal with Islamists afterwards, they're going to have a series of very bad, the Egyptian politics will seem like a series of very bad dreams. My guess is that they're there to stay, they're unavoidable, they're a part of the political system. Whether they will realize majorities in every race, I do not know, but I think it is quite possible. Hoping that they will go away is not a very effective way to deal with it, and I don't actually read the presidential election results quite the same way. And when you go to parliamentary elections, the simple fact is that when you look at how parliamentary elections are organized and the strong role for organizational presence in the various ways, the various systems that are being talked about for parliamentary elections in Egypt, you're likely to see an awful lot of Islamists, maybe not a majority, but you're going to see an awful lot of Islamists in the coming parliament.
Yeah, also, okay. and Amr, in your comments, if you can touch on the issue of a temporary versus a long-term constitution.
Sure, I will. Thank you very much. While I do agree and definitely agree with that when Poles speak, we have to respect, and otherwise we are not looking at a set of democratic rules of the game. And while I do agree that recent elections, which took place in Egypt throughout the last 18 months or a bit more, do attest to the fact that Islamists have a considerable weight on the ground, have considerable social and political capital, and they put it forward in elections, in parliamentary as well as in presidential elections, successfully. That should not be contested. And if we are interested in building a democracy in Egypt, where we are fighting as of now for the constitutional frame of reference of that working democracy, we have to respect the polls. So I'm not wondering about that, and I'm not questioning that. And I believe that it's much, much better for liberal politicians and liberal parties to stop doubting the results of the ballot box. They need to be respected. However, I am completely against confusing the Islamic identity of Egypt and political Islam. I am completely against confusing Islamism and the Islamic identity of Egypt. And to suggest that simply what political Islamists put forward by means of interpreting and by means of understanding what the Islamic identity of Egypt is, and to translate it politically into a push for a constitution that abides more by Sharia, I'm not sure what does that mean. I mean, if the constitution refers to principles of Sharia and as a prime source of legislation, I'm not sure what that more of Sharia in the constitution would mean. And I'm definitely against confusing the Islamic identity, which should not be, and unfortunately, that identity turn of Egyptian politics, which we have been suffering from throughout the last 2 years, has come about by means of pushing forward such arguments, confusing political Islam and their agendas and their platforms with the Islamic identity, and accusing liberal politicians and liberal actors of not abiding by the Islamic identity when they oppose political Islam and their platforms. That needs to stop, and otherwise we will continue to have a messy political debate which is taking us nowhere, a debate in which social and economic rights are marginalized, a debate in which the engineering of the political system is being dealt with in such an undemocratic manner that we will have a president once again with vast executive prerogatives and authorities, as if we did not learn from the last 6 decades of presidential despotism in Egypt. So it needs to be stopped, that confusion of the Islamic identity and that one grand narrative imposed by Islamists that we speak in the name of Islamic identity. They do not. And they are not the only actors on the ground. Even if liberals are weak in elections, Islamists are not the only actors on the ground, and they do not claim that one absolute claim of truth and in the name of Islamic identity they speak. They do not, and it needs to be stopped. Secondly, and I'm referring to a discussion which we have been having in Egypt, and I get, not shocked, but negatively surprised when, in a way, ideas, with all due respect, of authorities, legal authorities such as Tariq al-Bishri, are pushed forward, and as my colleague, Younger Brown, said. Well, if they were to compete with Salafi ideas or more conservative ideas of Islamists, those enlightened ideas are bound to win. No, that's not the case. In debates, maybe, but in politics, of course not. In politics, you have to look for actors, you have to look for parties, you have to look for platforms and who wins the elections. And what has been put forward so far is a considerably conservative understanding of Islam, religion, and politics. And Nathan referred, my colleague, my neighbor, my former neighbor in Vienna, Older Brown, referred to, I'll take one more minute, refer to Article 4 in the Constitution on Al-Azhar. Once again, there are many questions. I mean, how can you, if Al-Azhar's role is advisory, fine. Can a politician, as Nathan rightly said, stands up, can a politician stand up and say, I am against an advice coming from Al-Azhar? What are we enshrining and stipulating in the Constitution? And even by not mandating the institution which will consult Al-Azhar, the reference in the current article is simply, you can take Al-Azhar's advice is to be taken. Who? Who will go to Al-Azhar? A lawyer who would like to divorce a couple, or who will go to Al-Azhar? An institution, the judicial branch of government, or the legislative branch of government? I mean, unless we move beyond the generalities of Islamism and Islamic identity and not confusing them, we are getting nowhere. Final comment on Egypt. Half a minute. Egyptian Americans. Because I'm here, I was in Harvard 3 days ago. And before I entered this room, I was a friend of mine, an Egyptian friend of mine, living here in the US and working here, did show me a newspaper of tomorrow in Egypt, one of the dailies which we have, in which a fellow and an Islamist, a fellow Islamist, is attacking me after my lecture in Harvard, saying that I said strange words about Islamists. And so to give you a sense of what Egyptian Americans need to do, one, be aware that you are being monitored. B, be aware that whatever you say is relevant. C, be aware that Egypt's battles on the constitution, on its civil identity, on the Islamic identity, which is not contested, and what we are seeing is a politicization of identity that should not be part of political debates because it's there and no one is questioning it, that what we are having in Egypt is going to be settled domestically, locally. And what I'm saying here is exactly what I say in Egypt, unless we manage to get a better constitution for Egypt in which the mixture of religion and politics is not taken for granted, in which clear boundaries are defined to protect the state civil in nature, in which prerogatives of authority of the president are checked and balanced with a powerful and viable parliament, we are not delivering on what Egyptians demanded on January 25, 2011. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrit. Obviously, there's a lot more to be said on this issue. I'm afraid we're completely now out of time. We didn't get to our last speaker. In any case, please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers.
And I want to thank our wonderful moderator, Khalid Al-Gindi, as well as our panelists.